different type of audience, to be honest. So let's try that one. Yeah, the impact factor is important to people, and maybe that's the sort of institutional drivers as much as the professional drivers. But often we think that is driving submissions into the journal, but people are not thinking about the types of things that you mentioned, but are more interested in whether it really is important to get into a particular type of journal because of its ranking or the metrics or the success. So whether it links to, what's the H index, the impact factor, or whether that's prestige. But you quite rightly point out that actually there are much more important considerations when trying to choose, where to submit your work. And it's really wrong to just try and target the journal based on those impact factors or other types of metrics, because it's much more likely to lead to a rejection outcome. And the types of things that you mentioned about contributing to debates that are happening within the journal and making sure that there's a good alignment with your own research and maybe something of your own identity as a researcher that really is important, factor in driving whether you should submit that. And that was specifically the case for me. Finishing my PhD, I thought it was a bit sort of interdisciplinary and social sciences, sort of falling in between sociology and psychology and geography. And I had a sociologist, a psychologist and a geographer on my PhD Viva panel. And so therefore Annals was always the type of, was the specific journal within the tourism field that I felt my work would best fit because of that identity that I was developing at the time, and also because I thought that that was the most appropriate outlet for the type of work that I wanted to create. And I think that it's really important to state that there's like a massive array of journals out there, and at different points in your career, there are going to be choices that you're going to be faced with about whether you should submit to Journal A or Journal B, and the quality ranking of the journals should be the sort of very low down consideration in the type of factors driving the decision. It's much more about fit, but also, for early career researchers, you don't just begin your career, writing 4-star articles. Okay, it's writing research papers is about a craft, isn't it? It's something that you learn. It's a skill that you develop over time, and with that time you get more assurance. And so it's important to develop that in conjunction with the most appropriate target outlets for your research. And it's not always necessarily going to be the top journals always and at the very beginning of your career. Sometimes it's much more important to develop that craft in sort of lower ranked journals where you've got a better chance of success, and also where it fits best for that conversation to develop. We always think about reading the aims and scope of the journal and also writing for the journal. So this, I think that somebody mentioned it, sorry, but I can't remember who, but it's about sort of thinking about the tone of the conversation in the journal and its orientation to particular aspects within the field, whether that is theory or empirical research or methodology and methodological innovation, or whether that's policy or industry focused. And so thinking about tailoring what you write with the research that you've got, the empirical research data that you've got, towards a particular focus that journal is oriented to. So all of these different journals, but all of them as well, have different types of orientation. So for Annals, we have a link to the aims and scope in the rejection letters that we sent. Okay, so please make sure that you read the aims and scope of the journal. We've just revised it so that it's a bit more clear. Initially, traditionally, it was a very, very short statement, but it didn't really guide authors very clearly. So we've included the red text here, you know, about social sciences journal focusing on academic perspectives in journal and academic perspectives in tourism. And for the purposes of that, we define what those social sciences areas are and the sorts of topics that we're interested in as a journal. So we've got these sort of disciplinary areas: services, industry management, marketing science, consumer marketing, decision-making behaviour, business ethics, economics and forecasting. And it's true to say, I think, that this has changed. The journal has changed under the direction of Sarah Dolnikar and myself in a variety of different ways. Previously, it was less interested in publishing economics papers, for example. I don't know whether there's any economists amongst us, but we now think, well, why shouldn't Annals publish economics papers? Because it's a social sciences journal and economics is social science. So we've become much more open, I think, over the last 5 years in encouraging a very sort of broad-based, interdisciplinary social science perspective from all the array of social sciences. And also the way in which social sciences interact with other fields, so other sciences and other areas. So if we think about net zero and carbon, CO2 emissions and so on, well, that's more science, but we're interested in publishing work in that area where it can contribute to a better understanding of the effect on human behaviour, for example. So we definitely want to encourage interactions between social sciences and other branches of sciences and disciplines. And we've always put that there at the bottom, but to what extent people engage with that or not is different in different ways. And then when Sarah and myself took over as editors of the journal, we'd never met each other before, so it was very important for us to meet and discuss and develop a shared vision for the journal, the types of papers that we wanted to publish. And I think that all editors-in-chief, particularly of the top journals, have that in mind when they take over. They want to sort of say, well, what do we stand for as a journal and as editors of that journal? Because we thought, as I think many editors do, this is our only chance to try and shape the development of research in our field by being very clear on the types of papers that we want to publish. So you'll see these types of words and phrases used in all of the types of letters that we send out to authors. We're interested in courageousness, sort of big, new, bold ideas. And therefore, we're much more interested in, risk-taking research. So we'd like to see papers that are trying to do something innovative and different and take risks. Is the research credible? Can the research design generate valid conclusions? Is it replicable, relevant to policymakers? Obviously, within the UK context, we're interested in the way in which our research could lead to impact. So we want papers to reflect the potential for impact, and I think that many leading journals do the same. Transferable are the findings transferable across different contexts. It's okay to have case studies, and a lot of the articles that are published in top journals are empirically based, but it's the transferability that's important, I think. That means that the research or the empirics could be translated or transferred into other contexts. You can generate broader conclusions outside of that case study context. And is it readable? This is really important for Annals, which might be less important for other journals, which have a much more narrower focus. So as I mentioned to you before, we encourage more and more economics papers, but you tend to notice that economics papers are written in a particular type of way for economics journals and for economics economics or econometric audiences, right? So people that are familiar with the wording and the phrasing and the types of modelling and approaches that are used. But actually, we want those articles that are produced by economists to be read by sociologists or anthropologists. We want to make sure that the articles that we produce can be readily understood by a much more broader set of audiences. And so we put a great deal of emphasis on the way in which articles are written and presented. And I think that many journals do similar types of things. They want their articles, their published content, to reflect something about the vision and identity of the co-editors-in-chief that reflects the journal's aims and scope. I've talked for a few minutes, so I want anybody, please, if you've got any comments to make or questions to ask, please do.
Just a comment.
Yeah.
This readability that you mentioned is something that I just want to say that I experienced because I did work with Sarah. And I guess especially at the beginning as a PhD student, you try to, to write more compound, sentences and things like that. And just remember that she kind of removed all of that and asked me to make it like short sentences and very simple that could be read by anyone and understood by anyone. Just wanted to say that, yes, that's absolutely the case in terms of Annals.
Yeah, we sort of tend to think that we need to write our articles in a very sort of technical way, or that reflects the language within our disciplines. Whether that's a cultural geography article is completely different to a sociology article that we receive, and we want that the writing to be a bit more consistent than that, rather than just have it like a free-for-all. Any other? Yes, please.
To carry on this, do you think that really matters of the intensity, the frequencies of social terminology of the mentioning the field? If that's really matter in your decision when you say, okay, from editor's point of view, yeah, opening the door, sending to the reviewers, not. Do you think that matters? The terminology appear, how the intensity of that appear in the paper.
It's not the most important consideration, but if an article's readable and readily understandable and communicates its contribution very, very clearly, and particularly early on in the paper, that makes a big difference. I think that often you find some articles that are written in a very, very dense theoretical language that reflects the language of their own discipline, rather than the type of work that we want to try and publish. Then it becomes very difficult to make a judgment on that. Not that I make judgments on everything like that. If I feel as though I can't assess whether there's good potential for the article because the language is so dense and unclear, then there's a basis for rejection on that. But also then it's there's an opportunity for me to seek an expert opinion from an associate editor who's used to that language and understands that language and terminology, because it might mean that there's something there that I'm missing. So I wouldn't want to reject it out of hand. Yeah.
I wonder if I'm jumping a bit earlier for this point here. If, let's say, the chief editor passes on to a reviewer, you are in that stage as being part of the reviewer, it means basically from editor's point of view, they will not reject you. Like the door is opening out, just half opening, still opening. And then now, if you're in a stage of being reviewed by the reviewers, for the author, yeah, do you think we still have chance to be rejected from the reviewers, although the editor accepts it?
Yeah, I think, I'll come on to that, because Annals is I think that lots of the top journals operate in a very similar way to Annals, but Annals is a little bit different I think that there's some similarities there which would cut across different approaches. But I'll come back to that question in a minute.
It's good. How do you approach, as editors, how do you approach receiving conceptual papers?
Well, we're very open to conceptual papers because we've got a lot of, let's see if that goes back, I'm not sure whether it will, but we put a great deal of emphasis on advancing knowledge about tourism phenomena at a conceptual level. So if we don't encourage or accept conceptual papers, then how do we develop that? So I think that we've published more purely conceptual papers in the last 5 years than probably have been published in the previous 10 years. And we are very open to purely conceptual papers simply because we want to advance knowledge about tourism phenomena at a conceptual level. So we'd be hypocritical if we reject them. The problem is they're very difficult to get right, and that's a really big problem, I think. I'm not sure whether we train researchers very well at developing conceptual ideas and arguments, and that's, I think, one of the possible reasons why so many of the conceptual papers that we receive fail. But yeah, we do encourage that. Yeah.
What do you, what are the tips to getting those conceptual papers right? Because I do find them quite tricky, perhaps for the reasons you've mentioned. What do you look for in those conceptual papers?
Well, definitely, I've got a little bit more coming on that, so I won't cover all of it, but
yeah.
Definitely we want to see some conceptual ideas, frameworks, models being developed. And often that doesn't happen. You just get like an essay, which is basically a discussion of, it might be a conceptual discussion that doesn't really develop a conceptual argument or framework or model or set of propositions. For conceptual research to be good and successful, I think it has got to do something like integrating concepts, developing new concepts, or bringing together ideas from different disciplines, concepts, and bundling them together in a new way. There's got to be something there that's about development of concepts or constructs or theory, even if it's mid-level theory. Shall we go on and then? What's happening now? This one's not working. I wonder if that one's gone back to working. No, that one's definitely working. I'll tell you what, we can just do it this way, can't we? Gone again.
Try again.
Well, that's your presentation.
Try again.
There we go. Oh, we've got just a bit of a slide here, detail on the impact factor. I'm not sure whether it's relevant or not, but what we see is that the impact factors often drive submissions. Well, the higher the impact factor, the more submissions we get, basically. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're the right submissions or they're suitable for the journal. So I think that it's probably less of a problem within this audience, but some audiences, I think, would say, oh, we look at the impact factor and it's very, very important. Obviously, we want the impact factor to increase. It's good for us if the impact factor increases, but it's not the main driver for us. For Annals particularly, we are hampered a little bit, hamstrung, because of that multidisciplinary social science perspective. So sociology and anthropology articles that we get are less cited than economics articles. So we are always going to have that balance, that mix of different articles, and that's going to affect us in some terms, negatively compared to some of the more focused journals. So in tourism, Annals has always been social science. JTR, Journal of Travel Research, has always been a marketing journal. It's the journal of the Tourism and Travel Research Association in America, which is marketing. And tourism management, which isn't on the list here for some reason, oh, it's there. It's always been a management journal, so management and policy. So there's a lot of inward citations there and self-citations within the journal, which pushes that impact factor up. So we're not driven by the impact factor in Annals, and I think that lots of other top journals aren't that driven by the impact factor either, for various reasons. We would much rather have really, really good, innovative papers. We're in a very privileged and lucky position. We don't have to publish papers, but we get sent a lot of great papers, and we have a choice about which papers we want to publish, and we're very selective. The next thing really is about, avoiding and handling rejection. There's a range of reasons why papers get rejected, and often they're not the types of things that you think, not types of reasons that you think. So, I mean, our standard desk rejection rate is 71% for 2022. 2021, 73%. So it's sort of increasing, but it's increasing as the numbers of submissions increase. And what happens is, to answer your question a little bit, is that Sarah and I, as editors-in-chief of Annals, have a very boring job. Basically, our job is to just sift through all of the submissions that come in. Anything that really excites us, we send out to an associate editor, and they then handle it, and the review process is handled by an associate editor. So we don't get any of the fun stuff, working with authors and reviewers, basically, and developing that paper and seeing it through to the end. But all we do is basically make desk reject decisions. Everybody hates us, and then we send all of the things that we like to the, or we think that has potential, to associate editors, but they then also make desk reject decisions because they're the sort of experts in those specific fields. And so the overall rejection rate at the beginning is very, very high. And I think it's the same for all of the journals. And it goes back to that initial point about people being driven by the impact factor rather than the suitability of the article to the journal. So the types of things that we look for, and we have to work through this very quickly, I think, because of the volume of submissions, is a lack of fit with the aims and scope. The first thing that you said, is making sure that the article fits the journal. So sometimes we get papers that are just not tourism. They don't even mention tourism. There are no citations to tourism journals. Easy, right? It's a simple reject. And then there's this thing we agreed with Elsevier to open up a new journal called Empirical Insights, which is an open access sister journal to Annals. And we agreed to that not because we just think that we want to have more and more control and power over the papers published in tourism, but because we were getting a lot of really good quality empirical research, but that wasn't advancing knowledge at the conceptual or methodological level. So it didn't fit with Annals, even though we thought, oh, this is a really good paper. And we noticed that we were sending papers out to associate editors, and they were rejecting the papers, the good empirical papers, because they didn't have a strong conceptual orientation or focus or contribution. And then those papers that did get sent out to review came back with reviewers' comments recommending reject because of that same thing. So there were lots of ways in which really good quality empirical research wasn't finding an outlet in Annals. And we then agreed to set up Empirical Insights as a sister journal that was distinct from, but as good quality as Annals of Tourism Research. The next thing that we look for is text duplication. So we sort of have an authenticate report that comes with every submission. It's the first thing we do. is click on the Authenticate report to see what the score is. And if it's over 10%, it looks a bit worrying. And if it's over 20%, it's virtually guaranteed to be a rejection. But then we look at the report in detail to see to what extent there is duplication. Sometimes we send the papers back to authors and ask them to reduce the duplication score. But if there are sort of whole sets of sentences and paragraphs, then it's generally determined that it's not a good contribution. A lack of a contribution to knowledge, lack of transferability, some of the key things that we mentioned before. So it's very context specific, and there are no ways in which we can see that the learning from that research can be transferred to other contexts. Or the broader implications aren't considered. Poor illustration and readability, your point there about the readability thing comes back here. A very poor English, grammatical errors, too complicated, and so on. And the other thing is scholarly self-reflection. A great deal of self-citation, people developing their own ideas and constantly referring to those own ideas as being something that's important, but there's no traction for those across the wider field. So they're the types of things that drive our rejection decisions. Then we send them over to associate editors, and they generally look at a little bit more detail, particularly in relation to the methodology. Flawed research design doesn't generate valid conclusions, or they're not replicable. Lack of relevance maybe to academics, to residents, communities, or policymakers, or the findings don't support conclusions. Often there's sort of things like ignoring the fact that there's been a big sort of conversation in the journal on a topic or a related topic that's just been overlooked in the paper, and therefore that sort of undermines the whole sort of conceptual and methodological setup for the paper. And then we wrote a little viewpoint recently about qualitative papers specifically, why those get rejected. And there are a couple of points here that I think were fairly common. Having done hundreds and hundreds of these rejections over many years, you sort of get an idea of some very, very sort of common recurring issues. This lack of a methodology section for conceptual papers. Conceptual research requires an approach. There's an approach to doing conceptual research. You need to understand, or you need to describe what approach you took to the conceptual development. Vague or few details on methods, the sample, or the timing. Often, I think for Annals articles particularly, authors focus very much on trying to outline the conceptual orientation and the literature review section, and then they're squeezed for space, and they've got very, very little space, and they cut it out of the methodology. But of course, for qualitative papers, methodology is absolutely critical, because there's such a variety of different methodological approaches. What's innovative about your methodology? How have you advanced the methods in a particular approach that you take? All of those things need to be outlined, and they're often missing. And there's this sort of failure in conceptual design, this inconsistency between the philosophical, the ontological and epistemological assumptions that underpin the methodology with the approach taken to the data analysis. So where there's a sort of disconnect there, that is often a reason for papers getting rejected. And these are, often rejections after review as well as desk rejections. Too few papers that really link to the criteria for qualitative research, the quality criteria. Things like trustworthiness, credibility, transferability, confirmability. And also I would add to that, the positionality of the researcher. in relation to the data that they collect. And a really, really difficult one is that, the people outline a methodology and an approach to the data analysis. And then they describe the findings, but the findings don't illustrate very clearly the themes that they supposedly represent. So there's often a quite poor fit between the results that are provided and illustrated with the conceptual approach. So this sort of adds into this idea of a sort of poor story. The narrative doesn't really work there because there's that disconnect. Anybody want to make any comments about that or questions?
Just going back a couple of slides, when you're saying you reject things because the text is too similar, I mean, that's the same as turn it in for student essays, I suppose.
Yeah.
Do you send that back to the author highlighting which sections are at fault?
We don't.
So it's just...
We just expect people to do that. Some authors contact us and ask us to submit the Turnitin report.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, we get more and more authors contesting rejection decisions these days, because I think there's just so much pressure on authors, really. But we send them to the editorial office and we ask them to do it. So we just haven't got the capacity to engage with authors in reject decisions once we've made them, basically. I mean, obviously, if people have got a legitimate query about it, then we can look into it. But yeah, we rely really on authors doing their own checks before they submit the paper. And it's something I think that we tend to overlook. I've just submitted a paper myself yesterday to tourism management, and I didn't do it. I didn't run it through Turnitin, but I'm fairly confident that it will be a low score, but it's still something that you think, oh, I'm not going to bother doing it because there's another half an hour or something that I just don't have.
It's not something I'd ever considered doing, but I can see the benefit.
I think it's worth doing because, I mean, we use Authenticate, it's just what Elsevier runs everything through. But I think that Turnitin or any of the other ones would give you, they all run on probably the same thing. So
you just need to be careful. I heard the story of an academic who submitted their paper via Turnitin and didn't do. You have to kind of exclude it from something. I haven't really done this, and they put it through and submitted to the journal and came with 100% similarity because it was in the repository. So you have to be very careful if doing that. There is a I think there's some ways of doing it. So don't just put it through Turnitin because it might come up with if it's in the repository.
But that would be fine. That would be a good reason for an author to come back to us and say, hold on a minute, this is why it came up with that score.
And sorry, another question. So as editor-in-chief, will you read the whole paper or just the abstract or this rejection?
We commit to read everything. Now, when we started out in January 2018, and every paper took hours to read, and you just think, hold on a minute, I've got a full-time job somewhere that I'm not doing because of this. So we over time you become very efficient at reading the papers, and so that we can identify much more quickly now what we think is going to work with the journal and whether the paper's got all the right components to make it, a decision to send on to an associate editor. So we've become much more efficient, but we still do commit to read. We've never just based a judgment on the abstract or on the Turnitin report. We still look through the paper to see where the similarities exist.
Sorry, Scott.
Yeah.
How important are letters to editors? Because some journals make it, it's something that could be submitted with the papers, and sometimes you don't have to. So What's your kind of take on that? How important these letters to editors are?
I think that they're very important, and I think that the editor often reads the letter and it comes up first, and it's the author's opportunity to really outline why you think it should be considered worthy of sending out to review. So you can put things really consistently in the letter that won't be there, in any other section of the paper. Often what you get though is authors that just put the abstract in a cover letter. So this is, dear editor, abstract, thank you very much, love whoever it is.
Sometimes the letters to editors are actually quite useful for authors, because that's where you kind of have to pinpoint it and be very succinct.
Yeah.
And sometimes it helps you work through the paper as well yourself and kind of pinpoint what is it really that it is about. I think sometimes authors just leave it till the last moment, whereas I do think that it's one of the key submissions, because that's something that can really sell the paper or maybe not.
And we dropped it as a requirement at Annals. It used to be a requirement, but now we wanted to simplify everything as much as we possibly could. So we reduced all of that amount of stuff that people have to submit with every article. But we, I think that it's fair to say that the editors will read the cover letter. And you're absolutely right. You really have to sort of identify what the essence of the article is and what its contribution is, its main contribution, in a sentence or two sentences. It doesn't, nobody wants an essay, to read for the cover letter.
Sorry, Manet.
Yeah.
What is your position on working papers? So let me explain. So in several journals, I usually put a working paper just to have evidence that I started first, like in some area.
Yeah.
Because when you compile tech, you get the date, and then I submit it to a journal. I mean, it's a revised version, but still is like 80% of the working paper, and then they say, "Oh, your paper is the same as published thing on the web, reject." And then I have to explain. Did you see that actually it was like a previous or preliminary version of what I submitted? So sometimes they say, okay, take it down or something like this, or like. This might be also a warning that if you have some working paper and then you consider submitting it, maybe contact the series to take it down and then submit it, because they otherwise mechanically might see it as even though it's not published, right? But it's again in the database, and it could show up as duplication.
So where do you put the working papers? Then you publish them, self-publish, or it goes?
I mean, nowadays many universities pressure researchers to show ongoing activity. So it could be, let's say, University of Nottingham working paper series.
Right.
Or
in some disciplines,
we used to have one in Lincoln as well.
Okay.
In some disciplines, it's common as well that you build up a working paper and you take that paper around, and particularly economics, and then you sort of, get feedback from various different places, and then you submit it to the journal. So we're happy to work within the conventions of a discipline. So if that's
sometimes the conferences publish the papers.
Then we sort of ask them to take them down.
Nice.
Yeah.
There was a question.
I was just gonna comment on what our colleague said, because she asked about the way they. So, for instance, I don't know if you're familiar with the BAM conference. They run specific bits for research development papers, where you just publish whatever you're currently working on, get feedback. It can be good and bad. So it can be good. You can get feedback from several scholars in different areas, but it could be bad in that regard, that your work is already in the database, so when you try to publish it in a proper paper, it might get rejected. So
I think that's another way that you could use the cover letter. To explain, that this is a convention within your discipline, and this is how the previous versions of the paper were like this, and that would result in a similarity score and so on. But that actually what's happened is that this is the normal process for papers to go through within the discipline.
It's usually, I go.
Yeah, also, if I did, like, for example, one of my papers in industrial marketing recently, I mentioned that because I did present it in the previous conference, which got feedback. It means the paper being refined already before submitted to the field, in the journal. I think that's helpful. It's just similarity so that editor understand that if there's similarities, that would be our paper in that conference.
Yeah, the key thing is it's about compromising the blind review process.
Yeah.
That's what could happen as a result, because a reviewer might be searching around for similar papers and then find that actually this is identical, and therefore the blind review process is compromised. So that is an issue. Yeah, handling rejection. I'm not sure whether we need to go through all of this really. We know what it's like. You submit papers, you submit grant applications, you get rejected. It happens to everybody, right? Everybody gets rejected. Sarah rejects my papers, I reject Sarah's papers. It just happens. And we learn to live with each other. We just say, well, that's it. And it's absolutely normal, and you have to sort of develop a thick skin and say, well, that's part of the process. And actually, look for the reasons. Try to determine the reasons for rejection. We can't publish everything. I mean, that's one of the rejection letters. One of the comments in rejection letters you get from tourism management and JTR. Is we're limited on space and we can't publish everything. We don't say that. We actually don't have any limit. We could publish anything and everything that we wanted to, but obviously it's not in our interests to publish everything. So space is something, but fit is much more common. A lack of fit basically, or maybe too similar to recent articles. Maybe there's just a lot of stuff in that space coming out at the same time. So, sort of COVID recovery papers and things like that probably are more difficult to, create some innovative content around that. So the key thing is, what do you do with it? There's a nice little slide that I got, decide what you do next with it. Abandon the paper. Who wants to do that? Submit to another journal without changes or delay. That's a really big no-no for us, because we can tell when we get papers that have just been, recycled from JCR, because there are hundreds of JCR articles listed in the reference list, and none from Annals. And it's written in a very, very specific JCR way. Revise and send to another journal, probably a good idea, or appeal the decision. These are the things the options that are open to you. Nobody really, I hate letting things go. Don't abandon things unless it's a real bad one. You just think, I'm never going to get that published anywhere. I'd had one paper that I submitted to Annals, it got rejected because they said it was not enough tourism knowledge. I submitted to sociology, they rejected it, they said it wasn't really enough sociology. I submitted it to tourism geographies, they rejected it. They said it wasn't geography enough. So I'm not going to let it go. It's a good piece of work. It's a really, really good study. I really, really liked it. In the end, I submitted it to Tourist Studies, which is a 2-star journal, and I sent a really strong letter to the editor saying, this has been around all the houses, right? And it's, but underneath it, it's a good study. Send it out to review and we'll work with the reviewers. And they did do that, and the paper got published. And it was, we got really, really good feedback from the reviewers. And actually it made it a very, very, you know, I think a strong paper. That's, you know, my own opinion. We always think our own research is great, right? So it's like, oh, when you hit that submit button, you go, oh God, this is great. I love it. I think it's brilliant. And then you get the rejection letter, you go, maybe that's something different.
How many times do you send things out to the peer reviewers? Because I was asked fairly recently to be a peer reviewer for a paper, and I'm pretty sure I was reviewer 2. And the third time that I was sent the paper to have another look at, that it hadn't really changed enough. So I sort of basically said, I'm not playing with this anymore. But how many times do you go through that process?
Well, we have supposedly a maximum of 4 rounds of revision. And it's very unusual to have, you know, just 1 round. So normally 2 to 3 is normal. 4 a bit exceptional, but sometimes there are 5 or 6. So sometimes it goes a very long way. But if you're in that position as a reviewer and you've been asked to review something 3 times that hasn't taken on board your comments from the first 2 revisions, then you need to say something to the editor, you know, in the blind comments to the editor saying, the authors aren't working with me here. This isn't a conversation we're having. They're just ploughing the same furrow and just ignoring what I've got to say. Hence, reject. You know, if they're not willing to work with you, then you're well within your rights to change a major revision at the beginning to a reject at round 3. And we do have that. It's very unfortunate when that happens, but if reviewers don't work, if authors don't work with the reviewers, then it becomes problematic for the paper going forward. Yeah.
So yeah, I was actually asked question was actually about this. So actually, although the chair accepted and been, let's say, 2 rounds, and then the paper have been an author, if you do not engage in your response, it can still get rejected. Yeah, even after like 2 rounds. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Even after 3 rounds or 4 rounds or whatever it is. So it's really, really unusual and very rare and uncommon, and we don't want to put authors through a tortuous, long process only for it to be rejected at the end.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, if there's not, you know, if it looks like the authors can't do the revisions, they just don't understand them or don't understand how to handle the review process, or they just haven't got the data that would enable them to make the revisions, and they don't want to go out and get more data, or whatever it might be, then sometimes I think you have to sort of draw a line under things and say, I'm sorry, this isn't working out. But those are very difficult and rare situations, but it can happen. And I think if my other role is Associate Dean for Research and Knowledge Exchange in the Business School at Nottingham. So I've very, very many conversations with colleagues about papers that they've been in really top journals across the management discipline that have been, rejected at round 4. It's a very sort of much more common thing, I think, in some of those other top journals like ASQ, Management Science, Journal of Marketing, than it is in the tourism journals. So we're talking about reviewers and responding to reviewers. Are we okay for time?
We're okay, yes, we've got 15 minutes.
The review process is really a genuine opportunity to improve the paper. So I think that your comment earlier on was, once it gets past the desk rejection stage, what happens to it? It gets sent to an associate editor, and they decide whether it should be desk rejected or sent out to review. And it's not an automatic acceptance. It's the beginning of a conversation there, and your opportunity really to think about how you can improve the paper to make it a really, really strong contribution to the journal. So this is what we encourage as editors-in-chief. We encourage our associate editors and our reviewers to engage in a constructive process, a dialogue, a conversation with authors. So we have these different outcomes, which we've introduced many of these, and you know, the reject and resubmit is something that we have instituted at the editor-in-chief level. So we sort of think, well, this paper has potential, but they're not showing it at the moment. So we will reject it and offer an opportunity for them to resubmit based on the comments. Or we could say revise prior to review. That sort of gives the author a bit more of an indication, actually, that their paper would go out to an associate editor if they made a few more changes to it. So these things are sort of designed to, these decisions are designed to improve the chances of the paper right from the very beginning, to reduce the amount of effort on associate editors. We have a maximum of 50 associate editors on the board of Annals, and we don't want to give those associate editors too much work. We want them to work well with each paper that they get. So we try to circumvent some of their decisions by getting the papers improved if they show potential before we hand on to an associate editor. Then it goes to an associate editor, out to review. You could have major revisions, minor revisions, or accept after minor revisions, and these are the main types of decisions. Very rare to get, you know, accept after minor revisions on an initial, you know, it never happens basically, but there might be minor revisions. It depends on how good the paper is. And the other thing is that we want the process to be fast. We want everything to be fast, because if a paper is really innovative, it's timely, and it's therefore needs to be published quickly. And like I say, for Annals, and probably the same for most other journals, it is a conversation. We say prepare a 2-column table, have the comments on one side, how you've responded on the other. They should be really succinct. I work a lot with a PhD student, ex-PhD student of mine who's now in Nankai University in China. We were working on a paper with her once, and she prepared a responses to reviewers table that was 60 pages long. So, come on. You know, that's like double the length of the paper itself. Let's see if we can shorten it a little bit. You know, it's having a conversation with the reviewers, but not a blooming, you know, write a book about it. So make it succinct, on topic. Don't include the revised text, you know, because that's where you get these really, really lengthy. Just say where it appears in the paper, basically. And the really, really difficult thing, I think, is trying to navigate, you know, what the comments are. We generally have 3 reviewers per full-length article in Annals, like many journals. Sometimes it's 4, sometimes it's 5, sometimes it's 2, but generally it's 3. How do we then navigate, you know, the different opinions that the reviewers have got? And that's a really difficult thing to do, I think, and that requires a bit of skill. So we sort of tend to sort of sit down, reflect on it, give it a few days, come back to it, and then try to really distill what are the key points, the core areas that they find problematic, and address those things. And that's the, that's the way in which we approach it. But also, don't overlook it. Don't overlook some things, because I think that leads to the situation that you were talking about, where, hold on, you send it back to the same reviewers, and the reviewer says, well, hold on, you've addressed this point, but you haven't addressed that, or you haven't addressed any of my points. So how do I handle that as a reviewer? What do I take to mean from that you're not prepared to engage in that conversation with me? But also, I think that sometimes reviewers get it wrong. You know, they don't read the paper as thoroughly as they should do. They just make some sort of basic comments. What do we interpret from that? Not necessarily that they haven't understood the paper or they haven't read it. They might think, I'm not wasting my time doing a really, really detailed review for a paper that I think is going to get rejected on the balance of the opinions of myself and the other reviewers and the associate editor. So we can't sort of make presumptions, I think, about what reviewers are doing when they submit short reviews that point out some sort of major flaws. And I had this happen yesterday. I was looking into a paper. One reviewer had written a very, very long, detailed, critical review lots of point-by-point things. The other reviewer had written 4 points, very, very succinct and short, but there was a great deal of consistency between those 2 things. And as an editor, you think, hold on a minute, you know, that's serious shortcomings. I'm not going to infer that that second reviewer hasn't read the paper because they're pointing out very, very similar things. So as an author, I think what you've got to do is to try and work out what's going on in the mind of the reviewers and how you can best respond to that. And it's not necessarily as simple as it can be, because reviewers do all sorts of strange things, don't they? They say, oh, you know, I really enjoyed the opportunity to read this paper. It was a fascinating study, and yet it suffered from a few, you know, minor details that could be improved before it could be publishable. Then in the blind comments to the editor's boxes, this is rubbish and it needs to be rejected, right? So you know, there are people are being, we want people to be polite and constructive, and they are. But it might mean that they think, well, you know, this is not a good paper and it doesn't fit with the journal. But therefore, I'm just not going to say that. Or they say, well, it needs major revisions, but actually what they mean is reject. Or it's, you know, it's up to us as authors to try and work out how best to deal with that and handle it. Any comments you want to make about that?
I think I always find it interesting in terms of when responding to reviewer comments, in terms of navigating that, you know, how much I always engage with comments, even if I sometimes push back slightly. But I've worked with different co-authors. Some co-authors want to make all the changes, even if some of them don't really fit the paper. And often reviewers don't really mind, as long as we tell them why we might not be able to make those changes.
Exactly.
It's not telling them, I'm not going to make that change. That was not a good comment you've made as reviewer too. But I think it's more engaging in terms of, we thought about it, but giving a sound reason why we are not doing this. And I think that's okay, isn't it?
Absolutely.
But I have worked with some co-authors who just absolutely wanted to go for every single comment and implement everything. Whereas as an author myself, I sometimes just push back, because as a reviewer, I sometimes don't mind if they don't implement those changes. I think the best comment I've ever had is calling me a radical, and I thought that's what I wanted. I thought, yes, that was a rejection from that reviewer, but the paper has gone through because the reviewer completely took it from a different perspective. But the editors clearly saw that kind of mismatch. But I celebrated for about 2 days.
Yeah.
Isn't it a function of technology? So, for example, if you were writing papers in the 70s on a typewriter, then editors are much more lenient, and there were much fewer rounds of revision. Nowadays, because we have computers and processing software and data analytical software, they say, do these additional tests. Do these marginal changes and so on, because the technology allows you. Otherwise, you might even small changes, you have to retype the whole page on the typewriter, and then it all changes the structure of the following pages and so on. So maybe it's the availability of cheap technology that leads to the increase in pickiness sometimes.
That's right. Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's like the first papers that I submitted had to be hard copies, and they came back with, particularly from my external examiner, with those sort of syntax markings that you had to have a glossary to work out what the markings meant. They came back as hard copies, photocopied.
Maybe you touched on that earlier when I went out. So in regards to reviewers, so when you submit a paper, in some papers they ask you to suggest some reviewers, like 4, 3 or so on.
Yeah.
So as an author, when I put the names of some of the people that I think that the area of interest is relevant to be publishing, do editors take that into consideration, or?
Maybe. But probably not all of them. Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't do that. If you suggested me three authors, 3 reviewers. I might pick one, and then I'll pick my own just to make sure that there are, you know, that you're not just saying, well, you know, these are my mates. I'm not worked together before. So it's, yeah. But sometimes it's really helpful to have that because it's difficult, you know, to know everything and who's working in different spaces and so on. Yeah.
Do you mind? Have you come across any cases like having different reviewers having very different or even contradictory feedbacks, which makes it quite difficult for the authors to accommodate both of them or among the three of them?
That's very common.
Yes, because I have this kind of experience before.
Yeah.
Which makes really a hard time to how to juggle around. Yeah.
But that's the role of the associate editor. So the associate editor then, or the editor, you know, say for example, you've got a minor revisions, a major revisions and a reject, right? So it's then really the role of the editor to say, well, first of all, the review process is not a voting system, right? So if editors are looking at saying, well, that's 2 rejects and 1 major revision, therefore it's a reject, right? Because we're looking for the work that is really important. So reviewers are only there to give a recommendation. What have I done? not, you know, they give an evaluation and a recommendation. They're not making a decision. The editor makes the decision. And the decision could be that you have 3 rejects and the editor says, no, I'm not going to take those reviewers' comments on board. I'm going to say, I'm going to tell the author, everybody says reject, but I see something positive in the paper. You know, this is what you need to do to try and, you know, overcome the criticisms and concerns that the reviewers all share about the value of the paper. So it's really up to the associate editor or the editor to say, these are the reviews that we've got. They are mixed. And, you know, I'm giving you the opportunity to revise the paper, even though there's sort of mixed opinions. So, and then it's a case for the editor to distill out a few points that I think that are important, that would help you as an author to be able to progress the paper and see through those differences. But often that doesn't happen. And that then it becomes a problem. But we always encourage the associate editors to do that, to not to treat it as a voting system. The reviewers aren't decision makers. The editors have to decide. Well, I don't think we need to talk about this because otherwise we just sort of run out of time. But professionalism and politeness is really important, I think, because believe me, everybody is stressed out to the max. Everybody in the system. Editors, reviewers, authors, managers, everybody. So the last thing that we need is some really, really horrible toned email from an author, you know, contesting things. And it doesn't help anybody in the end. We just have to put it behind us and move on, basically. So the last bit really is about maximising the visibility of your accepted manuscript. You know, we get that. Hooray, it's accepted. Break open the champagne. Let's now bask in the glory and sit back and let's take the rest of the summer off, right? And then that's it. But I don't think we can afford to do that anymore. You know, we have to really then work with that acceptance as authors as well as editors. So we do our bit, we try and do as much as we can, but what can authors do? Well, first of all, you could, you know, try and get your repository, library, university to, you know, go for the open access. And a lot of the universities now have got subscription agreements or access agreements or rights agreements with the publishers like Elsevier. So check out with your library what agreements you've got to make sure that the work that you've produced is open access. You can put it on your own repository as well. But also, you were talking about working papers earlier. You can use, as soon as the paper goes into review, you can upload your paper onto Social Sciences Research Network or SOCAR, one of the archives, SOCARVIX, that's it, isn't it? or PubMed in the States. And actually that increases the visibility of the article massively. So you get a much better outcome. I think even at the early stages of review, you can make that open access and it won't make any difference. We had this first of all with a PhD student of mine. We worked with her on a paper that was published in Annals eventually called If I Was Going to Die, I Should At Least Be Having Fun. And that was like, that was my main contribution of the paper, was finding that quote in about 100,000 words of text that she got for her PhD. I just thought that was such a great quote. And obviously a title is a really, really important aspect of a manuscript. A catchy title, I know I hate to say it's a catchy title, but a title that is meaningful, but also, you know, has the ability or the potential to draw some interest is important. But she got some funding somehow to get it paid for gold open access. And it really sort of became then one of the most downloaded articles in Annals during the early days that it was published. Well, for like 3 or 4 years afterwards. And we now have, you know, I think it's almost 200 citations from that article in 2015. So it's, you know, try and explore how to create meaningful open access for your work, even at the early stages as well as after it's submitted or published. And then, of course, we've moved into the social media space. Sarah, having never had any social media accounts or activity before, and we've had a discussion about it. And I've got quite a big list of followers on LinkedIn, but Sarah decided to go for the Twitter. And once Sarah decides to do something, she doesn't just do it, you know, in a half-baked way like I would. She goes in 179%. So she's like the Twitter queen now. But it's great that we've got all of these things going on Twitter. We've got a channel on Facebook, and we sort of feed into the TriNet community, which is a tourism research community. It's got, 4,000 followers and so on. So the Twitter thing is really important. And now we're sort of pioneering this idea of video abstracts. So we give conditional accept decisions now, and we really ask authors if they will upload a 2-minute video abstract of their article. This one is fantastic. These Chinese authors have just done a brilliant, brilliant job about robots and whether humanoid robots make a difference in service. And they have this conversation between them. They're in different spaces. And the robots talk and everything. And it's brilliant, 2-minute little video. But it's then something that we can post out and tweet. But it's also embedded in Science Direct in the article. So at the end of the reference list, you can just click on this 2-minute video, which shows you the authors and outlines the work in a sort of audio-visual way. It's a really good way to improve the access to the research. Anybody interested in the submission process in the last 2 minutes? What you need to do? It's like baking a cake. Make sure that all of the ingredients are there. Are the research aims and objectives really clearly defined or outlined in the introduction to the paper? Is the intended contribution to knowledge clear? Is prior work in this area really discussed? Is the methodology and research design clearly explained? And do the findings really fit with the approach taken? And are the insights that gained relevant somewhere beyond the context of the study? These are the types of core questions, I think, that you can ask yourself when you're producing the manuscript. We talked about plain English, submission process. Each journal is very sort of clear on the submission guidelines. Ours, the key thing, the killer for people that submit to Annals is a maximum of 9,000 words on initial submission. You can go up to 10,000 words when it goes into review. But authors just get, they write the paper, it's 10,000 words, and then they come to submit it and they realize that it's 9,000 words maximum. So they either just submit it and it gets sent back, or they then just chop a big chunk out of the paper and submit it anyway. And it's like this huge gap in the paper that's not explained, you know. So make sure that you submit the paper in a way that it meets the technical guidelines. Otherwise, it just delays the whole thing. Formatting, I don't think we need to talk about. Oh, there is a couple of things here though. We ask people now to explain the author contributions, so that we, you know, all of this gaming where, oh, you know, you haven't written this paper, but you need your name on a paper, so we'll just add your name as the last author. We've made that credit statement now compulsory. We ask people to upload their research data, supplementary materials, give access to the data to other researchers, declaration of conflicts of interest and funding sources. So
Okay,
we've had some questions anyway, haven't we?
I think we've got some time. So
Sure.
if there are any questions from colleagues,
Yeah.
Samira.
Is the process for the curated collection different from the journal and manuscripts?
Yeah, that's a good question, because we also pioneered this idea of curated collections. The publishers wanted us to do virtual special issues. We're just not interested. But actually, Annals will be 50 years old next year. We're having a big celebration, so there's a big anniversary thing going on. But that means that actually there's 50 years worth of knowledge there in their back catalogue, you know, tons of stuff. So we wanted to reimagine this thing, and it's the idea that we came up with at the Corthy conference in Cairns, where we wanted it to be like a museum, basically, so a curated collection. So associate editors become the curators, and they basically then solicit papers and they write a review paper, and then they go back through all of the back catalogue and we collect all of the previous research on that topic. So they're topical areas of research that have got really lots of things going forward, but also that connects to a back catalogue within Annals. Only associate editors can be curators. So that's where it's different. We don't ask anybody to be a curator. But yeah, they're very, very popular actually. We've got more and more coming out each year. And for the 50th anniversary, there'll be something different. It'll be a specific special issue. So it'll be the only special issue that we have. It won't be a curated collection.
I mean, when we submit a paper, do we need to mention if it is for a specific?
Yeah, that's right.
And it
You
goes
can
directly to that.
You can add it in to the cover letter that it's intended for that collection. So then it will go to the associate.
I think curated collection is a great idea, because it's also not only good for academics but also for students. So I sometimes would recommend for students, you know, social tourism, for example, has one, and you can just tell students, well, that's where you can start. And I think it's brilliant for them, because sometimes it simplifies, because they feel it's a bit overwhelming, isn't it?
But they're also living things, so they're not sort of fixed in time. It means that new submissions, you know, once a collection is live, people submit, they read through that, they go, oh yeah, I'm doing some research on that, I'll submit to that as well. So it's not just one thing. It grows and grows and grows organically over time, and then new papers, as they become accepted, get assigned to those collections, and it just develops the topic. And then we have something else, which is article collections, where we collect articles on a particular topic across Annals and Empirical Insights now together.
Any other questions?
Sorry, about the video that you mentioned, you said conditional acceptance. So does it mean the video comes at the first stage when you submit your paper, or this is after you get the acceptance, you were asked to create a video?
Yeah, the conditional accept is something that we've had to implement, because all of the back office systems now, the production systems, are completely automated. So what we found was that there was all sorts of errors coming out in published content, and you'll see that across lots of Elsevier titles, you know, lots of crap being included in the paper. So we because of it's all automated, we've got no control over it. Once an associate editor clicked accept, it just went directly into production. And then we were reading through things and finding that there was lots of stuff in there that we didn't want. So now everything goes through a conditional accept, and we ask authors to go through a list, a checklist, to make sure that their paper is formatted correctly. And that's, so it's after the review process, it gets conditionally accepted, and then you'll get an email from Sarah and myself saying, please do this checklist. And one of the things on the checklist is, please consider uploading a 2-minute video of your, of your work.
Excellent. I think we ran out of time,
Thanks
so
very much.
please join me in thanking Scott will have to leave shortly, but if you wanted to have an informal chat, we'll probably move out.